Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this online event on towards establishing an EU real-world evidence generation action plan for better healthcare systems and patient outcomes, national, European and international perspectives. And I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of Real World Evidence for Decisions. My name is Jackie Davis. I will have the privilege of moderating our discussion this afternoon. And we're going to have a series of sessions with some presentations and discussions. And in longer sessions, there will be opportunities for you to ask questions too. If you want to ask a question, please go to the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen and write your question. And please be brief, not long essays, not long comments, just so I can see at a glance what you want to know and who your question is for. If you want to tweet out about what you are hearing at this event, and we do encourage you to get that real-world evidence message out, please use the hashtag RWE4Decisions. Ladies and gentlemen, at this point, we were due to have a speech by the Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium and Minister for Social Affairs and Public Health, Frank van den Broeke. He will be joining us later, but he has been held up in an urgent meeting in the European Commission. So we're going to hear from him a bit later on this afternoon. So it is my pleasure to open proceedings more formally to welcome Dr. Rui Santos Ivo, President of the National Authority of Medicines and Health Products in Pharmed, to talk about the next steps in realising an evidence generation action plan. He, of course, talking because of those council conclusions referring to such an action plan under the Portuguese presidency of the European Union back in the summer. Dr. Santos Ivo, very good to have you with us, sir, and over to you.
Hello, good afternoon to all of you. I would like to give a special greeting to Joe de Kock, the former CEO of the Belgian Army, for inviting me to attend this conference. Of course, I also would like to greet all the colleagues that are participating in the conference, and I had already the opportunity to follow this very important discussion that we just had. So also my greetings to all of those who are attending this conference today. As I said, I'm very pleased to be here, and I think it's very important moment that Real World Evidence for Decisions organizes this conference entitled Towards Establishing an EU Real World Evidence Generation Action Plan for Better Healthcare Systems and Patient Outcomes. The participants of this conference probably all recognize real world evidence as a complement to evidence from clinical trials to support regulators and HTA payers' decision making, and also to support healthcare professionals, particularly in relation to highly innovative technologies with limited evidence. With the increasing development and market authorization of advanced therapeutics with limited data, but also with high costs, most regulators, HTA and payers have developed their own initiatives to foster the collection of real-world data, develop methodologies and specific analysis. As examples, we have DMA with guidelines on registry-based studies, UNETA with a request tool, the regional initiatives that we just listened to, such as the ones that we heard, and other initiatives like the one that is gathering us today, the Real World Evidence for Decisions. Each country is also developing registries, collecting and analyzing data in order to fill their own specific needs. For example, in Portugal, we use real-world evidence to complement our reimbursement decisions with outcome-based managed entry agreements. We have two main approaches, the use of registries that were developed by Pharmed, like the one we have implemented for hepatitis C, and the more recent one for spinal muscular atrophy. And also the use of registries that are developed by other national entities, like it is the case of the cancer registry. We use these registries to condition the reimbursement to the achievement of specific positive outcomes in medicines like the ones I mentioned for spinal muscular atrophy, but also, for example, the CAR T cells. Probably most of the HTA bodies and payers agencies participating today are also monitoring these medicines, which have been already mentioned. Since more of these medicines have been given conditional authorization, there is also a need to provide additional data on its benefits and risks for regulatory purposes. So we are doing the same, but probably not in the more efficient way, considering resources, experience, and analytical capabilities. Although regulators, HTA, or payers have different remits, we consider that we should start focusing more on what we have in common and foster synergies. The Council conclusions that were adopted last June during the Portuguese presidency of the EU state the fact that improved data requirements in relation to stakeholders may benefit from a dialogue between regulators, health technology assessment bodies, payers, patients, and healthcare professionals at the appropriate level. They recognize that real-world evidence can complement regulatory knowledge, reduce evidence gaps in HTA and payer decisions, and support medical decisions on best treatment options. The document also welcomes the future proposal for a European health data space to promote digital health and to leverage data quality by establishing a strong infrastructure and interoperability for developing a system of data governance and rules of data access and exchange with emphasis on data privacy, as well as the data analytics and the real-world interrogation network, the Darwin EU project, which can be a synergic tool for this initiative. Member States and the Commission are invited to explore the possibility of establishing a real-world data collection and evidence generation action plan by promoting better collaboration between ongoing national and cross-border initiatives. This may include the development of a robust framework and methodologies in a multi-stakeholder approach. It is undoubtedly necessary to have a better coordination at European level of the several activities that are being developed in order to avoid overlap and application of initiatives, not only between regulators and HTA agencies, but also with other regional or European entities. We need this collaboration in analyzing real-world data, but also on the way we can have access to this data. And for these initiatives like the European Health Data Space and the Darwin Project should play an important role in being integrated. We believe that the current context provides for the right moment to enhance and build up a proper European framework supporting the use of real-world evidence. The experience generated by the pandemics, the various initiatives anchored on the EMA Heads of Medicines Agency Strategy 2025, the approval and imminent publication of the HTA regulation, introducing a health technology assessment framework in the EU, the initiatives stemming from the pharmaceutical strategy, the European Health Data Space, and various other developments indicate the need to ensure a necessary coordination at EU level while supporting the initiatives at member state level. The outcome of the initiative that brings us today has shown the importance of an integrated dialogue amongst the different stakeholders, particularly concerning the use of real-world data when assessing the value of treatments for patients and healthcare systems, and the need to identify the specific gaps and uncertainties with regard to access, availability, and affordability of highly innovative technologies. The ongoing process of revising the pharmaceutical legislation provides a unique opportunity to ensure that existing experience and activities gain a more robust support by adopting an integrated framework addressing the needs of the different users of real-world evidence. Also building on the activities that are bringing us together in this conference, I believe that a high-level platform on real-world evidence at EU level could be a very concrete starting point to address coordination and integration of different needs and support a coordinated agenda on issues such as the availability of the use of health data to serve health-related public interest purposes, common data elements and formats, quality assurance, data standards, common policies to minimize barriers to sharing data for health system management, statistics of research. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I wish you a very fruitful discussion, which I'm certain will continue during the afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, RWE, and for your great insights there. And you said at the end there, this is the right moment to build that proper framework. And you talked about the role that a high-level platform could take. I'd like to come back on those issues and discuss where we go from here to deliver on all of those things. I'm going to move to our first session, real-world evidence for decisions learning. I was going to ask you to create me a word cloud, but we'll do that a little bit later on. We're going to hear about real-world evidence in outcomes-based managed entry agreements. And I'm going to hand over for this session to Dr. Karen Facey, who is visiting Senior Research Fellow at the Usher Institute at the University of Edinburgh. And she's going to present the learnings from a series of case study workshops that were held this summer, and then she'll moderate the rest of this session. Karen, thank you for leaping in to the breach. Over to you.
It's my pleasure to be here with you today as a consultant to Inami RISIV. So if we could go to the next slide, please. What I want to give you is a quick overview of real-world evidence for decisions. It's a payer-led, multi-stakeholder learning network. It's meant to be pragmatic and agile, to discuss use of real-world evidence to inform HTA and payer decisions, that is pricing and reimbursement decisions about highly innovative technologies. And why are we focusing on highly innovative technologies? Well, we've been excited to see a number of these technologies come through in recent years. But what we've seen is that they often have accelerated pathways, which mean that they have immature clinical evidence for us to be able to make a decision on them about their added value in our own healthcare systems. So to determine whether real-world evidence can help us resolve some of those evidence paucities for these highly innovative technologies, Inami RISIV, under the leadership of the former CEO, Yoda Koch, established this real-world evidence learning network. And it's really built on the principles of collaboration and transparency. And Yo has this great phrase, which we all take to heart, which is learning by doing. In the words of Greta Thunberg, no more blah, 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 let's get on and do it. So what we try to do is share experience, pool resources, create synergies, and take a kind of sandbox approach where we're looking at the real issues that HTAs and payers are facing and discuss how in collaboration we can solve them together. We do this by bringing people together, but by producing public outputs, and this webinar and symposium is one of those. Next slide, please. If you want to know more about the work we do, you can see here the kind of people that have been involved in our work this year. The people that get involved change depending on the initiatives that we're undertaking, but we have a good range of HTA bodies, national health insurers, clinicians and researchers, academia, patients, regulators, industry, and we're very ably supported by a secretariat led by FIPRA, the policy organisation in Belgium, and they are funded through sponsorship from a range of pharmaceutical companies led by the Industry Association UK. On the next slide, you can see that you can visit the Real World Evidence for Decisions website to find out more about the work that we've done this year, a range of webinars, and we try to publish in peer-reviewed journals as well as sort of white paper reports of our work. I'm going to focus now on the next slide on this key work we've been doing this year about outcomes-based managed entry agreements. That's a bit of a mouthful, so I might call it OBMEA. And we see the potential for use of these so-called outcome-based managed entry agreements with these highly innovative technologies when there are uncertainties in the evidence base that are really important to the payer decision-making. And there's a potential that those uncertainties could be resolved by additional data collection. So we're looking at the particular form of outcome-based managed entry agreement where we make an agreement and say over 3, 4, 5, 7 year period, we need to collect additional data from the real world in the hope that that can help resolve the key uncertainties that payers have seen at the initial discussion of pricing and reimbursement. So we got together the multi-stakeholder group you've just seen, and the first thing we did was review recent work that had discussed the potential use of these forms of agreements. And there's been great work done by the great Get Real collaborative, particularly Amma McCarty at Zinn, did a very thorough review talking about the challenges of these kind of agreements, because they seem great in principle, but actually they come with high administrative burden, and they rarely deliver sufficient evidence to inform later reappraisal processes. We've also seen the work of the European Network for HTA post-licensing evidence generation publish really interesting results last year, particularly the case study about creating a data protocol for cross-border data collection for Spinraza, and the project I was involved in, European Commission-funded project Impact HTA, which developed tools for HTA bodies to really support not only initiation but conduct of these forms of agreements. So what we did in real-world evidence for decisions, taking that kind of sandbox approach, was to take two fictitious cases, but which were pretty realistic. When I describe them, you'll see that they are the types of products that we've seen and continue to see coming through, but have issues with the sufficiency of their evidence base for payer decision making. So firstly, we took a therapy that's given at regular intervals to children with a rare neuromuscular disorder. And the second case was a one-off cell therapy that's given to adults with late-stage cancer. And the first thing we did was review the evidence that was available for these fictitious cases and identify the decision-relevant uncertainties from the payer perspective. And this was quite an interesting process because we ended up with a long list of kind of 10 or 12 uncertainties. And one of the key things we had to do was hone that down to 2 or 3, which we felt we could realistically discuss and obtain data for. We then discussed the potential data sources where we may be able to resolve these uncertainties in different health systems across Europe, and also from other sources, such as from patient groups, from medical research charities, from what industry could collect. And we discussed the pros and cons of different data sources. Then we tried to create a sort of data collection protocol that was aligning data requirements that could be used across borders. And I'm going to now present on the next slide. One of the key things we do in real world evidence for decisions is try to present actions for different stakeholders. So on the next slide, I'm going to focus in on the kind of overarching recommendations from this detailed report. The report will be published by the end of the month. It will have all the detail of the workshop discussions, but I'm presenting the kind of top line for you here today, and I'm going to be discussing them with some panelists that were involved in the workshop. So our first key recommendation is it's too late to start thinking about this at the point of pricing and reimbursement. For many of these highly innovative technologies, we need to be thinking earlier. So national or collaborative horizon scanning procedures should be horizon scanning to see which highly innovative technologies might need additional real-world data collection when they come to a pricing and reimbursement initial decision. And if we identify those, it could be that those collaboratives want to instigate iterative scientific consultations, or what we used to call early dialogues, to discuss those real-world evidence generation plans and resolve as many as we can by the time we get to pricing and reimbursement, but also discuss what might be needed after initial reimbursement. And also at that point, initiate any governance mechanisms that may be needed to access databases. So thinking about, for example, disease registries, how do you access those registries, and what data permits are needed, for example, to access to health system data. And this could be done for an individual treatment, or it could be done for types of therapies or for a particular disease. Going on to the next slide. We then thought about the initiation of the outcome-based managed entry agreement, and to say that these things shouldn't be used for every product that's coming through. They should really be rarely used because there is a major administrative burden with them. But for the important therapies in areas of high unmet need, they could potentially be useful if we can be sure they can deliver sufficient data for the renegotiation. And for that, we need HTA and payers to really clarify a minimum core set of decision-relevant uncertainties for which we should collect data. And then we need to think, particularly for rare diseases and for small countries, how we collaborate across borders to collect that data. Moving on to the next slide, we then think about how we collect the data and do all we can to ensure high quality data that is sufficient for decision making. So that means that we need HTA and payers to firstly engage with regulators. And we see this as being really important to understand what post-marketing authorization regulatory requirements are needed. And we'd love to be able to tap into the Darwin network. We're very excited by Darwin. And I think in the final panel, this will be discussed today. But we need to engage, make sure we're collecting data from all best possible sources. We then need to be transparent about our data collection protocols. If countries are doing this, we need to make sure they're publicly available so other countries can know what's available. And we see the emergence of public portals, for example, those from ISPOR, which are now enabling that. And alongside this, we obviously need publicly available statistical analysis plans. And finally, in addition to those kind of individual considerations for an outcome-based managed entry agreement, moving on to the next slide, there are some underpinning things we need to consider. We need to consider financial investment requires, particularly at government and national levels, to improve data collection from within our own health systems and think about investment in this area so that actually we can optimize use of these treatments and create savings by optimal use. So investment in good data to create a good learning health system. Real world evidence for decisions itself needs to continue doing work to bring stakeholders together. And we see a real gap in terms of the area of guidance on what is good real world evidence. So we need to work further together on that. And finally, we think we need to go from a fictitious case study to having real examples of where HTA bodies are working together to implement some of these recommendations. So we need some demonstration projects, perhaps from Benelux or Fenosa. So those are the key recommendations we came up with. And I'm now delighted, if we go to our next slide, I can introduce you to our panelists. We have Anna Nacht-Nabel, who's a senior HTA expert at the Austrian Social Insurances. We have Herbin Nabarat, who's Deputy Director for Public Affairs at AFM Telethon in France, and he was involved in the neuromuscular study discussion. We have Karen Coulton, who's Global Head of Payer Engagement at AstraZeneca and here representing UCOPE, and Nicole Mittman, who's Chief Scientist and Vice President of Evidence Standards at CADA in Canada. And it's my great pleasure we can take the slides down now and just invite my panelists to the audience, as it were, to the discussion. And I'm going to start by turning to Anna. You work in an Austrian payer sort of setting and were involved in the discussions. What do you think about the recommendations that we've just presented? Are they realistic for you in your working life?
So thank you very much, Karen. I hope I have more luck with the technique today, since we have not been blessed. Also, thank you for allowing me to briefly reflect on the recommendations you have derived. You've mentioned very important points so far, but I want to emphasize a couple of them again out of the payer and also HTA perspective, since we're responsible for both. So first of all, I want to emphasize that the OB-MERs should only be indicated really in exceptional circumstances. So ideally, as an HTA and payer agency, we would like to have a comprehensive data set already at the time of marketing authorization, since we all know that usually the evidence is generated for the for regulatory and not so much for HTA and payer decisions. So ideally, we could use then this evidence for assessing the relative effectiveness assessment. So in comparison to what is at hand, if we have something. However, in selected situations, I think they're also highlighted, or at least implicitly highlighted in your recommendations. So when the benefit of having a new product available early on outweighs the high uncertainties at decision making, the OBMEAs might offer one possibility. But again, we would like to have ideally also then less complicated schemes, such as budget caps or simple price volume arrangements. When I read the recommendations, what struck me a little bit was that there was hardly any mentioning of the manufacturer's responsibilities. So a lot of the burden seemed to be shifted then to HTA and payers. And you, Karen, you mentioned already the high administrative burden for conducting these OBMEAs, for data generation, analysis, monitoring, etc. So, but we only have limited resources at hand. So, but tied with the recommendation of identifying potentially suitable products early on via horizon scanning activities. I think you're all familiar with the newly implemented IC project, for example. This would allow to start really early in the life cycle. So, with an iterative dialogue then between all stakeholders prior to marketing authorization, I think this would then allow to plan the post-launch evidence generation, which then can also influence the ultimate decision-making in the context of HTA and payer decisions. So ideally, we could also then tie these data on effectiveness to obligatory requirements for the marketing authorization holder, so that will also be the responsibility of the manufacturer to generate this data. Then you mentioned also the European collaboration, and as you heard that I'm from Austria, so we're not a large country. So it's really very important, not only for orphan drugs, but of course, especially for orphan drugs, to have this exchange on a European level. So you're familiar, I'm sure, about that we need to develop a joint understanding of which outcomes to generate, also which suitable study designs can ultimately address the open questions. Clearly, also, we need a suitable infrastructure for data gathering and data exchange. So you mentioned the EU Darwin project, and since I'm not 100% sure what will actually or how we can be involved in that, but I think this is a very good project which will offer a lot to payers and HTA bodies. It struck me one recommendation where you talk about the transparency and also making the subsequent decision making as well as the specific data collection plans public. I was a bit reluctant to accept those. I'm very sure, I know that transparency is a key factor, but for instance, my agency, we don't publish our HTA assessments, so only the final decisions are publicly available. So I think this can be addressed, but of course we need to be very cautious not to share any confidential information of outcome-based managed entry agreements. But I think in general, this will depend on the granularity of the information we share. And of course, if we focus on the clinical requirements, I think then it could be done that the information will be available for the public. Lastly, I think the point you've mentioned in this last recommendation, I think more guidance would be very welcomed for us, how to implement these, how to generate the proper fit-for-purpose data. And also, of course, this guidance should be influenced by good practice examples, ideally generated through the networks you've mentioned, just as Benelux or Finosa, as an initial response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. I can see that we're going to be cut down on our time, so I'm just going to ask you one quick follow-up question. You raised there the challenges of the transparency issues in your own country and that only the decision is reported. Do you think there's a potential for clarifying the decision-relevant uncertainties? Are they sort of part of the decision that could be presented, because actually making that clear could help the discussion of alignment of data collection?
As you know, it's a decision is always about value. So I think we have to differentiate between the financial uncertainties and the clinical uncertainties. In terms of the clinical uncertainties, I think these can be highlighted and addressed also then in collaboration with other agencies. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. And Anna, you kind of raised some really important things there, sort of confirming this is exception, not rule. We'd like the best data possible, but the need for collaboration. But you also gave us a bit of a challenge of kind of what's industry's role in all of this. And so I'm going to ask now Karen to respond to that. What is industry's role in all of this?
Yeah, thank you very much, Karen, and to the panel. So there are 3 observations surrounding these recommendations that I want to share that came strongly in both the webinars, our experience, and also FPA's recent paper on novel payment mechanisms. And the first is around partnerships. So I'm really glad Anna asked the question or challenged us on it. This is both partnering to align on the process and approach for data collection for an outcomes-based agreement. But I also agree industry absolutely has a role to support the building of infrastructure and share that burden incurred, which could be financial. And for this, a theme that came up was the need for trust and collaboration between all parties to be able to partner on that. The second is around simplicity, and I think Anna mentioned this one as well, and you call out in the recommendations. And we've learned from experience, there's no need to collect all endpoints, if only 1 or 2 remaining uncertainties, but only what's sufficient to make a final decision. So I think that's a really important call out that you make. Additionally, we tend to find the most successful approach is simplicity through using existing data infrastructure. So are there already registries, hospital, regional or national data collected, which could be built on and used rather than building from scratch? And then the third observation is around early dialogue. So I think it's great that we call out horizon scanning, how we can use horizon scanning more effectively and formally to standardize, to understand not only what is coming from a product perspective, but the likely data gaps from a payer perspective, and then together discuss the potential means of data collection and discuss and overcome any barriers to achieving this, which could include the governance piece that you mentioned. So I suppose in summary, these 3 themes, partnership, simplicity and early dialogue, came particularly strongly in both the webinars and from an industry perspective. And I think are really well reflected through the recommendations. And given that we see across countries, there's variation in approaches to all of these aspects, I really applaud RWE4Decisions as a learning network to share ideas and solutions to data collection for reimbursement across different stakeholders. And certainly applaud RWE for taking on the challenge to produce guidance from that, because I think that's certainly necessary to help standardise the process.
Thanks, that's super, Karen. So you're talking there about the need for simplicity, and I think we all agree on that. We're kind of recognising we can't have the long list of decision relevant uncertainties. We need to focus on what's key. You mentioned their potential data sources, and that moves me on to our next panelist, to Hervé Nabarat, because it's easy to think, for us to think about health system or clinical registries, but patient groups are more involved in registries and data collection now. You were involved in one of the workshops. What's your view on the recommendations and what we're discussing here today?
Thank you, Karen. Yes, we were very interested in our participation in the workshop, because the real-life monitoring of innovative medicine is important for conditional coverage. But beyond that, I would say for HTA more generally and for post-authorization monitoring, to be able to answer some questions like, will the treatments be more effective for certain groups of patients, for example? Or if you consider a disease like spinal muscular atrophy, we begin to have not just 1 treatment, but 2 and 3. And this is an important question, obviously, what effects of combination therapies that begin to appear in some diseases we follow. And moreover, as patient representatives in this workshop, we try to pay attention to certain methodological aspects of these collection plans. For example, identify different outcomes, because some patients can have good results on one, other patients on the other, and this comes from different manifestations of illness in the sick people. So for us, it was interesting to put the stress on that. Once we have said that, we can wonder more generally what could be the role of patient in this data collection. And regarding the method, they can be consulted or be part of the governance of registries. And on the substance, I would say, first, patient can contribute to the definition of the data that will be collected, not to forget important data, to emphasize quality of life data. And secondly, patient help to define collection methods, especially for data entered by them in terms of feasibility, also considering the fact that some patient data entry can reduce the burden on practitioners, on physicians. We can wonder if there is some quality issue concerning that. And I would say that if patient-related outcomes are well done, if patients see an interest in them and can access the results, they will enter the data correctly. And on another level, for some registries, patients are owners and they define the valuation and the pricing principles. And this is our case. We do that, in fact.
Thanks very much, Hervé, for those reflections. They're reminding us that many rare diseases in particular are heterogeneous. And so although we'd like to only collect a few outcomes, we actually need to collect the outcomes that matter to patients and recognize that there may be some diversity in those outcomes and that the engagement with patients to discuss that is key. I mean, you mentioned a number of things there, including patient-reported outcomes, registries, etc. One of the kind of follow-up questions I have for you is, are we placing too much burden on what we expect from patients and patient groups in these processes? Because we're kind of seeking to get you involved in a range of areas. Is there a way in which we can make this more efficient, or is it reasonable?
Yeah, perhaps there are different levels regarding patient data collection. I think that there is a great responsibility for companies and public authorities to design patient-related outcomes that are easy, useful, and provide the measurement tools, for example, applications, measuring devices, and so on. And this will encourage patients to fill them out. And on another level, regarding the definition of data and collection methods, we must remember that patient groups often have mechanisms for sharing expertise among themselves, and this can help them to play this role. And moreover, I think that the best practices that will be defined about the data collection management will help target the input of patients so that they can focus on their experience, expression, and respect for their right.
Thanks, Hervé. So again, a message which is about, let's not leave this all to the end. We need patient engagement as far in advance as we can to develop the right patient relevant outcomes, not just patient reported outcomes, and then take that through and involve patients throughout to understand what really matters and what really creates a difference to patients' lives. So I'm going to turn now, and you may think this is odd because everybody sees real world evidence for decisions as an EU initiative, but we were delighted to engage with colleagues from CADA in Canada in the workshop. So I'm going to turn now to Nicole to say, Nicole, you know, it was a kind of European-based discussion we had. We were talking about cross-border. Did it have any relevance for you in Canada?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be on this panel. And I have to say that Canadians were an opportunistic interloper into this EU process. And we were very pleased to be observers, and partly because one of the things that we're trying to think about very, with certainly a thoughtful process is how do we incorporate real world evidence into our health technology assessments at CADTH. And we were very keen to understand the model and took away learnings that were where you have cross-border discussions of how to share data or how to be transparent across countries or how to involve different patient organizations and clinician groups and payers. We have that same kind of model in Canada with our various jurisdictions. And so thinking a little bit around, the large geographical mass that we have, yet the patient population or the population of Canada may be similar to a smaller European country. So if we're thinking about rare diseases, how do we actually incorporate? How do we collect? And so that means thinking about standards and thinking about your guidance. How do we ensure that we're using common outcomes? How do we ensure that we have guidelines that are in alignment? And should we share perhaps data from other countries? And how do we look at the evidence that way? Certainly, we're embarking on a learning journey for CADTH that is looking at how to incorporate real-world evidence along the life cycle of the technology. So, my ears are pointing upwards when you indicate early scientific advice. Is this an opportunity for the patients and the clinicians, the stakeholders who are also the decision makers, the payers, and the data holders, as well as the academics and the health technology assessment groups? How do we actually learn what are the gaps that we need to address by collecting follow-up data? And we're looking at it as complementary to clinical trial data, not a replacement. Right? We know already that no clinical trial will be long enough or wide enough or have the most appropriate population or even the right comparator. So those kinds of issues that we are thinking about from a real world evidence space was really ably discussed at this EU meeting that we were lucky enough to participate. And we took those learnings and actually held our own meeting about a month ago entitled Our Best Brains Exchange, where we brought that was funded by our Canadian sort of research funding organization, Canadian Institute for Health Research. We brought together the regulator, Health Canada, our organization, CADTH, and the patient group, the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, to actually lead a similar kind of model of understanding a mock disease and then looking at gaps and then also talking very concretely about infrastructure required to do that.
Thanks so much, Nicole. And I was privileged to gatecrash on your Canadian work as well. And I think it's interesting that a different setting, but similar kind of challenges, but real opportunities as well. And you opened our minds to the real need to engage the data holders, the organizations with data analytics expertise, and that's something that a real world evidence for decisions has already identified in its past work. You also mentioned there the importance of thinking about the use of real world evidence over the life cycle of the technology, and I can see there's been a question about that. And just to say, yes, indeed, in real world evidence for decisions, we think about the use of real world evidence over the life cycle, and some of our past presentations and documents cover that, particularly Trust for RD. I would send you to the website to have a look at that particular document. But in this particular workshop, we were looking at this one specific case. But as you said there, real world evidence can be a complementary form of evidence to demonstrate the value of a highly innovative technology, but we all need to work together to ensure it's robust enough for decision making. Now, unfortunately, panelists, I would love to go on talking with you, and I'm sure we will in 2022 within our Real World Evidence for Decisions Learning Network. But for the moment, I'm going to hand back to Jackie because I think we may have some of the earlier technology problems sorted out. Thank you all so much for your contributions today.
Thank you very much indeed, Karen, and thank you to all of your panel. You've identified some really important questions there, as you say, that how to make sure it's robust enough. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to move on in a moment to a session on cross-border initiatives, real-world evidence frameworks. And I'm just double-checking, and I hope I'm just about to do something I want to all of you to get involved now and give me an answer. Before I do that, if I could just ask the speakers in our next panel to all make sure that they have accepted being panelists and put their cameras on so that we're ready to go to you straight after this. The question, audience, that I have for you, and there is a word cloud button in the right of your screen. If you could click on that, and you've got a little bit of time to think about this because we're going to come back to the answer before our final panel. The question I would like you to answer, give me a word, one word, which describes what you think is essential to include in an EU real-world evidence generation action plan. Let me give you some examples. You might think funding is the most important thing. You might think interoperability is key. Is it HTA payer involvement? What for you is key? And is your key thing a what we need to do or a how we need to do it? I throw those thoughts at you. As I say, during the course of this session, this 30-minute session, you will have a chance to put your answers, and then I will have a look. So a little bit of time to think about what one word sums up what you think is most essential. But let's move on, as I said now, to a session on real-world evidence frameworks in cross-border initiatives. So I'm going to ask Aldo to tell us a little bit about the Benelux initiative. If there are any specific questions to Aldo, I'll take them immediately after. Then I'll bring in Fleming and Tuomas to present their initiatives, and then we'll have a bit more time for questions after that. So please do put your questions in the chat box if you have any, and don't forget to fill in the word cloud. Aldo, very warm welcome. Over to you, sir.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present here today on behalf of the Benelux initiative. And I would also like to thank the first panelists, especially the one from CADEF, because there was a lot of recognition of the dilemmas when working together with, well, in your case, provinces, and with us, in our case, the smaller number of a number of smaller countries. First slide, please. So the Benelux initiative, for I think most of you will know the Benelux. So the next one, please. Yes. Okay. Now I can see them. Thank you. So most of you will probably know the Benelux already. It's a voluntary collaboration between 5 countries on pharmaceutical policy. So it's Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Austria, and Ireland. And just to give you a short overview, our main goals are to ensure access to innovative drugs at affordable cost, and to face the challenges that drive pharmaceutical prices and spending. So we collaborate in several areas. For instance, we participate in horizon scanning, and the International Horizon Scanning Initiative is actually an initiative that has started in Benelux and is now an independent organization with 8 countries that are participating in this initiative. And so we're very proud of that, of course. So we share information and we exchange knowledge and expertise. We perform joint collaboration. We have a collaboration on health technology assessment, and in particular, of course, on those products that afterwards we perform joint price negotiations on. One of the last, or the most recent successes of that was Zolgensma, on which we had reached a joint agreement a few weeks ago. Next slide, please. So within Benelux, just to give, I'll try to give you an overview of the discussion or the dialogue on real-world evidence in Benelux. So first off, we do very much recognize the value of collaboration in general, and also we see the opportunities or the potential for collaboration when working with real-world evidence. So we do see a value in the current collaboration in regards to the use of real-world evidence. As I said, we've had experience in defining common criteria for required additional data as support for HTA assessments. So that's within the regular HTA work. We've been able to engage with manufacturers to define relevant outcomes to assist in joint HTA work. And also due to the close relation with our payers, while having national differences, of course, we do see the opportunities to find consensus on useful outcomes of additional studies. So that's something that within our current collaboration, we've already been able to establish. And not to forget also, it can be beneficial in sharing resources and expertise. So that's something that we've been doing all along. And this is, I think, an important basis if we move on in the realm of the use of real-world evidence. That said, we currently do not have very specific real-world evidence cases. In that sense, post-assessment data collection, you could say, is easier said than done. So we are discussing, but we have no specific cases at this point that we're trying out. So we're currently limited at learning by doing yet. Next slide, please. So in our dialogue on the use of real-world evidence, we see that the use of robust real-world evidence could create an opportunity for decision-making in collaborations. And this has been said, of course, many times over. When it comes to HTA work, for instance, in the case of relative effectiveness and cost effectiveness, especially to manage uncertainties in the determination of the value of the initial health technology assessments. Now, in pricing, when it comes to the assisting the quest for new payment models, like pay-for-performance models, in order to compensate for uncertainty at launch. And this can make outcome management entry schemes possible, but also I think Nagnebel said something earlier about this as well. This could also mean that we could use or resort to simpler schemes such as the budget cap or others. We also see the benefits of early involvement in real-world data setup. As a collaboration, it's easier to come up with a consensus on the way in which real-world data should be set up. And also, it gives you a better platform to discuss with other stakeholders. It's also a valuable additional source to the clinical trials, as said, but no replacement. And also, the question is how to collect real data in a harmonized way across borders in order to generate evidence that meets the needs of joint HTA and pricing initiatives. And the question is also, how can we identify the relevant questions that can be convincingly answered by the use of real data? Can it assess its limitations, or how can we assess its limitations within a spectrum of national interests? And this was already said, that there is a dilemma there. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at the dilemmas that we've identified to overcome, you can say that in Benelux, we found that there currently is a limited number of international registries that address payers' needs. And this is especially important when working together in a group of countries with nationally different systems. There's also currently limited opportunity to address payers' needs in early scientific advice. And although working together in the EU HTA collaboration could change that in a sense. So that's a promising opportunity where at an early stage, HTA and payers' needs can be addressed. There's also still a spectrum of opinions on which questions of HTA and payers can be answered or supported by real data. As has been said in previous meetings, it's important to overcome national differences in the approach and the needs of real-world evidence cross-country collaboration, but preferably in a broad group of countries in order to find consensus. Consensus on the right questions to be addressed in individual cases, agreement on data collection requirements and the assessment of real-world data, on a harmonized approach toward national registries, and differences in guidelines, not only at the time of the start, but also further down the line. To overcome differences in reimbursement systems and criteria in a way that outcomes of real-world evidence will remain relevant to all participants, and to ensure sufficient resources. It's labor intensive from early dialogues all the way to interpretation of the outcomes down the line. This is not an easy topic, and also within a collaboration, not something that's easy to solve. So how can we add flexibility to changing demands over time? It's important to make sure that real-world evidence selection is sufficiently set up in a way that over a long period of time, outcomes will still be useful to decision makers down the line. How can we move towards a more standardized approach to collection and the use of real-world data? There needs to be more agreement among HTA bodies and payers on the potential use of real-world evidence and its limitations, including the required expertise in order to support real-world evidence. Sufficient resources should be also made available to develop and maintain common standards and tools, as well as to maintain long-term data collection and analysis where real-world evidence is to be used as a tool for decision-making. And it's necessary to set up a mechanism to allow for exchange of real-world evidence needs and plans between countries and along the pharmaceutical chain. To conclude, cross-country collaboration allows countries to discuss and overcome some of the fundamental questions on the use and usability of real-world evidence. It can also serve as a testing ground for real-world evidence approaches. And Benelux would be interested in, or is interested in pursuing that further. But it also requires a more structured approach and sufficient resources to reach a point where payers can have enough confidence to successfully and more structurally adopt the instrument. We're very interested to learn and contribute to this joint effort as we move forward. We look forward to the exchange with other collaborations and, for instance, CADIF. So that's also why we support the coordinating activities on EU level, such as have been described by RWE4 from Informed. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Aldo, and lots to come back to in our discussion a little bit later on. But I'm going to bring in now, I don't see specific questions from our audience yet in the chat. So let me bring in our two other speakers. We're going to hear about the Nordic Pharmaceuticals Forum and Finosa, because I think some of the questions about these sorts of cross-border collaborative initiatives will be in common, and we can discuss them among the three of you. So let me turn first to talk about the Nordic Pharmaceuticals Forum to Flemming Sonne, CEO of Amgros Denmark. Flemming, great to have you with us, sir, and over to you.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here today, and it's a very brief speech I will keep today, but I think we'll have the first slide. I'm the chairman of the Nordic Pharmaceutical Forum. And I think it's very important to understand that, as well as Aldo told us before, it's a voluntary collaboration we have. And I would say we are more, even if we compare the two groups, we are, more practical in the way. We have a lot of group and we are not placed to the Minister of Health in Denmark. We are divided into the regional setup that we have in the Nordic countries. But we have the Minister of Health that had accepted that we work together. Can I have the first slide? Just to show you briefly about the organization that we represent in NLF, we will say that we have the experience with 6 different groups, 6 different areas where we work together, where the real-world data is very important. That's, of course, in the new expensive drug. But also we use the horizon scanning as an area. We have the security of the supply, manufacturing, environment, and of course also we have done some cross-border tenders or procurement. The second one is actually running now and has been quite successful. If we go back to look what is actually the things that we talking about when we talked about the data and what is needed out there, I will say, when we went into this collaboration, our idea was actually to share all the knowledge that we were able to have some inspiration from the different countries. But the fact is, actually, we have tried actually to set up a shared negotiation between the country. We have a different structure. We have a different setup in the different countries. We have a different timeline. And sometimes it's very difficult actually in practice to bring it out. I do know that Aldo talked about it. It works, and I really hope we can have some inspiration and learn from each other as well as we have done during the years. But I think to be honest with you, I think the issue that we are going to talk today, we can't not solve the problem on a national level. We can't solve the problem in a voluntary collaboration between the Nordic countries. We have to find out where is EU in this case. The fact is that we see very, very small patient group. And if we should collect for 20 people or 25, 50, 100 people, it doesn't make sense and it won't change a bit. So I think it's very important that EU find out what is the opportunity, where to bring in the data. And I do know there's a lot of experiment work across Europe at the moment from the hospital level. But on a national level, I think it's very important to let EU understand that we need them. We need also EMA in a way to face the fact that most of the new product coming to the market, the rare diseases, we see phase 2, orphan drug status, and we need all the post-launch follow-up on the drug. And I think that's where we really need a collaboration between the countries. I think one of the idea is in behind by this meeting today. Where do we find the real place for this kind of data? And I think we have to actually bring it up to EU to continue this work. We have tried to share what we can on a legal level, but we will not find the uncertainties in the small patient group that we had. I think that will be my last word for today.
Thank you very much indeed, Flemming, and lots to come back to about that role of the European Union. I want to ask all of you a little bit later on what really good collaboration looks like. So yes, you said there are limits to what you can do through this voluntary collaboration, but what does it look like? But we'll come back to that. Let us hear, to complete the picture of our cross-border initiatives, from Tuomas Oravilahti, who, as I mentioned earlier, is a pharmacoeconomist in the Finnish Medicines Agency. Tuomas, over to you.
Thank you and good afternoon. I guess I had one very colorful slide somewhere.
There it is. Oh no, hang on. There we are.
Yes, there. I tried to include everything there. So Finose is a HTA collaboration between Finnish and Norwegian and Swedish HTA bodies. We started officially 2018. We work under Memorandum of Understanding, which defines our aims and rules for the collaboration. We do both clinical assessments and economics, but we do not do any decision making, and we do not negotiate on pricing. So these are like the basic facts. But on the picture below, this is the basic idea behind the Finose collaboration. So instead of trying to build new processes for the joint work and then try to somehow use that work, instead of that, we rather wanted to work together during our normal processes. So we wanted that the Finose collaboration is something that happens when we are doing things that we would normally do anyway. And there's two things we need to do. We need to have to do this. So on the left side, I guess I don't have a pointer here, but on the left side you can see the submissions from the company. So we need to synchronize the submissions. So the company is submitting the material at the same time to all three agencies, so we can start working with the material. We also need to have a waiver. That's why the arrows there, the blue arrows. We need to have a waiver from the company so we can talk about the confidential material. But in practice, what we do is that we have shared the responsibility of writing the assessment report. One of these agencies is writing the clinical part, another one is writing the economics, and third one is working as a reviewer. So this is the way to save working time and also to get a peer review at the same time. We also publish this, the green stuff, the Finose report, as a single report, but there's some local details that need to be added for the local decision making. For example, there can be different pricing for different countries or some other details that need to be added. So those are added before it goes to national processes. But I also included this big blue box, actually two of them. One of them is on negotiation and pricing, and the second one is on decision making. So in principle, we have three different decisions, but there is a possibility to have joint negotiations in between. And this has happened once after Finose assessment so far, And in that case, also Denmark and Iceland were joining into the negotiations, which were based on the Pinnacle report. But yes, this was my slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tuomas. Thank you to all of you. I just wanted to start by coming back, and the same question really to all three of you about what good collaboration really looks like. What would we say defines successful collaboration? And crucially, and Flemming, I think, touched on this earlier when he talked about the different structures, different timelines. What are the biggest barriers to collaboration that need to be overcome? Flemming, you raised the point. What for you makes collaboration really work and helps to overcome those barriers?
I think you need to have a very well done structure, and we do know that what kind of competence we have in our group, in the different working groups. But due to the fact, if we're talking about data, which was the point here, is actually the collaboration about data, that is very limited because the national legislation about sharing data from one country to another country is very limited. So we have to find out what to do in this area. I'm not specialist here, but I'm just told that this is actually a problem we have to handle, and probably the same kind of problem that we see from other countries around Europe. We have a history now for 6 years, and I think we have found out that we can't live without each other in our daily practice. We have found out where it is needed. I have a friend, and perhaps I could try to call it elder, but I haven't done it very often. But I have done that in a very few times where it's needed. On a daily practice, actually, some of my colleagues, some of my employees in the company called the other countries to find out what is happening here. Do we solve the same kind of problem here? Can we do anything about it? And I do some of the people that are actually from my country today is actually having the daily dialogue with the other countries around how to handle the crisis that we see. Before we go into negotiation, they will talk to the other ones and try the other countries to find out how had they handled the situation here, and what was the key point. Not to be, of course, on a legal aspect, we have everything is clear where we are allowed to share, but there are some limits where we have to face. For example, the price. For example, some information about patient data, which have to be blinded in a way to do that.
Thank you very much. Aldo, same question to you. And particularly, I mean, you talked about the importance, and we heard about it earlier, of identifying the right questions and getting a consensus on what those questions are. What for you is the key to building that consensus?
Wow, that's an additional question. That's a very interesting one. I think just to start off with your first question, what makes collaboration work, or what is needed? I guess a few things. Teamwork, and I'm not referring to your national teams, but to make sure that you form teams of people from different countries, because those personal contacts, the fact that you can pick up the phone and you can make a joke, you can tell a joke, and then get into the serious discussions because you know each other so well, is something that has worked very well for us. And just like Flemming said, not just for us, also between, for instance, the Benelux and the Nordic Forum, there is a regular, I think almost weekly connection there, talking about new developments, discussing potential thoughts and ideas and brainstorms and a variety of pricing reimbursement issues. So just a willingness to connect and to understand that we face the same challenges, and that there's not, a border is not a barrier. It's just simply a line on a map, nothing else. That also requires political backing, of course. I mean, you have to be able to work from a political background. But it's also, I think, the willingness to adapt your national policies whenever it needs to happen. So having an open eye, listening to the discussion. And for instance, if you look at the discussion today, we can all hold on to national registries or national needs, or very specific national questions that we might have to be addressed with real world data down the line. But if we all stick to our own questions, we're getting nowhere. So the willingness to adapt, to listen to others, and to find the consensus on what the most important common factors. I think the willingness to do that is, I think, a very important one. And I think and the last one is resource allocation, the willingness for each country to actually make sure that there are resources to pick up the phone and to pick those topics that you find important for collaborating moving forward, and adjusting allocating resources accordingly. And that is a challenge. That's a big challenge.
Thank you very much indeed. Thomas, same question to you. Based on your experience to date and this, it's the way you are working on producing these joint assessments, what's the key to making it work? Would you agree with what's been said? Would you emphasize something else?
Well, I'm not sure if we have found the key yet, but like Aldo said, it's big issues to know each other and to be able to talk about issues related to the assessments, but also on other issues. When you know people, it makes things so much easier.
We began to talk earlier and in the panel, Karen's panel, about post-launch evaluation and the increasing demand for real-world data after market launch, and it's becoming increasingly important. Do you address this issue in your cross-border initiatives, or is it addressed in your countries? Is this something you have really looked at? And I think it was Aldo who said earlier, post-assessment data collection, he said, easier said than done. What are the challenges here? Thomas, is this something that you've been working on? Is this something where you've done any joint work yet?
No, I think it's more related to the price negotiations and managed entry agreements. So I think that there should be a pull for the information. So there needs to be a need for it. Yeah.
Thank you. Aldo, you said easier said than done.
Yes, well, I meant you need to have the infrastructure in place, and you need to have a common understanding of your informational needs. And you need to be able to follow through, and especially if you stretch your data collection over a longer period of time, markets change. So you have to be really sure to get the question right, and to make sure that you have answers that you can use later on as payer. So the outcome of your efforts should be able to should be valid, or should provide you with valid information for decision making, and finding. In a collaboration, finding consensus on that, and still having the appropriate questions, and achieving results. That I think was that's very very difficult. Let alone the fact that you simply have national registries, individual registries. You have doctors and patients in nationally that might have differing opinions or guidelines that can change over time. So these are all the dilemmas that you have to factor in, and so that's why it's easier said than done.
Thank you very much. Fleming, a thought from you on this. Is it something that you are addressing? Is it something that is being addressed at all, do you think?
I think it's a very good question, as well as Aldo answered before. I think it's the same issue that is happening here. But end of the day, I think Thomas said before that it's up to the price and the reimbursement discussion. But end of the day, we have the exchange process. And when we have finished that, we have the negotiation with the price, and after a while, we will actually end up say yes or no, or limit use for the product. But that's based on the local market for the Danish market, not about the Nordic market, because that would be for NOSE or some of the other discussion we have. So I think, as I mentioned before, I think we need a centralized follow up on the product, not only for the Danish market, but when you are on the EU market, you have to follow up on this. And that please take I really said, please take the agenda back, EU, instead of having the pharmaceutical industry to do that. I'm sorry to be unpolite to the industry.
I want to end our discussion with a very quick sort of what your key ask from the European level in a moment, but some very quick questions from our audience to all of you. Are you experiencing issues on data sharing because of privacy issues and no prospectively collected consent? What solutions are you discussing? Can anybody come in on this one? Anybody want to? No? Are you having any problems at Thomas? And then Aldo.
Yes, well, this is an issue we talk a lot about. Can we share this information to another country or not? And if there's a very small number of patients, is it recognizable? So does it become somehow like private data which should not be shared? This is an issue, yes.
Thank you. Aldo, you wanted to come in?
As far as I understand, that is also one of the questions that need to be addressed. It's not something we actually are looking for a solution right now, but it is something that's on the horizon. Yeah.
Thank you. And Aldo, there was a specific question to you from Alessandra Blonder at KU Leuven, who said, will reports on Benelexa discussions or assessments be made publicly available in future? For instance, she says, in the case of Zolgensma.
Yes, I think the reports, so the outcomes of the health technology assessments, are made publicly available through the websites of the HTA bodies that collaborate in Benelux. So, for instance, Zolgensma, if you go to the Dutch one, the Dutch Healthcare Institute website, then it's there. I think it's in English as well. So
Thank you very much.
And the other one, thanks. If you look at discussions, we do have, when there are certain discussions on, for instance, transparency or other discussions, we do have statements on them. There's even one together with the Nordic Forum, and those are regularly published on the website as well.
Thank you very much. A very quick last question to you all. And Fleming, it relates to the topic of our next panel, where we're going to talk about the building blocks for establishing an EU real-world evidence generation action plan. You talked about the role of the EU and underlined it very strongly. If you had one key ask, a key next step, if you like, to ensure that the EU maximizes its contribution to meeting the challenges we've discussed, but also realizing the full potential benefits of real-world evidence, what would your key ask be? What do you want to see in that action plan? Same question to you all, 30 seconds each, if you would.
Oh, that's difficult. But anyway, I think I would give the answer. The question to you is actually how to build an EU database where everybody can put their data into. We have the application for in EMA. Why do we not have the database and a demand from your side actually to stay on the market? You need to bring in some data, and we need also to bring from our side, from the national level, to bring in some data from our side, so we can collect a database and also put that pressure from your side, from the EU side, in front of the price, because we have a lot of uncertainties where we need to find some answers there.
Thank you very much, Fleming. Tuomas, your key ask from the EU policymakers.
Well, I would like to see more interaction between the regulatory side and HTA people, especially on defining the requirements for additional evidence. So that would be my hope for Christmas.
Thank you very much. Aldo, you have the last word, your key ask, the key next step.
Well, I almost have nothing to add to what Fleming and Thomas said. I think those are the clear wants or needs. But in addition, if I need to add something to that, it would be involving payers and HTA bodies more in the early scientific advice or the early dialogues. Making sure that the answer, the questions that need to be addressed are discussed with companies really early on in the process.
Thank you very much indeed. And we do have to end it there and move to our closing panel. But thank you so much to the three of you for sharing your experiences, sharing your insights and the learnings from your initiatives. Very grateful to you all. I'm going to introduce our final panel in a moment, ladies and gentlemen, where, as I said, we're going to talk about those building blocks for establishing an EU real-world evidence generation action plan. We're going to try and pull the strands of all our discussions this afternoon together before later on we hear from the Deputy Prime Minister. Could I just ask our next panel, we're going to have a look at the results of the word cloud in a moment, but before I do that, could I ask those in our next panel, if you haven't accepted the request to be promoted to panelist and turn your camera on, please could you do so now, and I'll come to you in just a moment. But before I introduce those speakers, you'll remember that word cloud, the question I asked you. One word to describe what you think is essential to include in an EU real-world evidence generation action plan. Let's have a look at the results and what you said. So there was the question really of the what, more technical. Is it money? Is it interoperability? Is it data quality? Or the how? Is it about collaboration? The word collaboration, the word we've heard most. If someone could put up those word cloud results for me, so that we can have a quick look, that would be terrific. If not, I will come back to them a little bit later on. And as I say, I just need to make sure that the rest of you, all the panelists, here we are. Well, coming through loud and clear, the word we have heard most, collaboration. It's disappeared from my screen. If you could bring that back, please, so that there we are. Collaboration, absolutely front and center. Data quality, an issue many of you have mentioned. Interoperability, absolutely vital. And a multi-stakeholder approach. Funding is there. I'm a little bit smaller. We've had quite a lot of talk from our panels about the importance of putting the resource behind this if it is to work, not given as much as priority by all of you. So more of the focus really on the how, having that multi-stakeholder approach, having the collaboration, but also those crucial issues of data quality, funding, interoperability, and so on. Fascinating stuff. So thank you very much from that. So let me now bring in our panel who are going to join me to discuss those building blocks, as we heard earlier. And you will all know those council conclusions from last June, which talked about having a real-world evidence generation action plan and exploring the possibility, which is what the member states and Commission are doing now. Joining me to discuss this and where we go from here, I'm delighted to welcome, to give us a regulator's perspective, Dr. Peter Arlett, Head of Pharmacovigilance and the I can never say this word, Epidemiology Department. I told you, I still got it wrong, at the European Medicines Agency. I don't know, I have a blind spot about it. From the pharmaceutical industry, delighted to welcome Alexander Natz, Secretary General of the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Entrepreneurs, EUCOP. From the HTA bodies, to get the HTA bodies perspective, Judith Fernandez, Project Manager, Pharmaceuticals Assessment Department at the Haute Autorité de Santé, HAS. A payer's perspective comes from Dr. Diane Kleinemans, President of the Commission of Drugs Reimbursement at the Belgian National Institute for Health and Disability Insurance, INAMI-RISIV. A patient perspective from Jan Lecam, CEO of Eurodis, and from the European Commission, Flora Giorgio, Deputy Head of Unit for Medical Devices and Health Technology Assessment in DG Santé. So, panel, a very warm welcome to all of you. It is very good to have you here, and I don't actually see you on my screen at the moment, but there we are. I can see most of you now. I think we have a couple of people missing, but we will get underway because time is of the essence, and at 4:20, we're going to close this discussion to move to hear from Frans van den Broeke. Let's start back at the beginning, if we might. And Peter Arlett, if I could come to you first of all, in terms of the role of real-world evidence, because we've heard complementary to robust clinical trial evidence and so on. Very much, it's not a panacea, but it can play a crucial role. Where do you see it playing the most important role, and where do you think not? So what should we be focusing in terms of when to use it?
So thanks very much for the question. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to represent medicines regulation in this multi-stakeholder discussion. I think the first thing to say is to confirm your remarks that we see this real-world evidence as having a concrete role in medicines regulation throughout the life cycle of medicinal products as a complement, not as a competing force, to other data sources and other methodological approaches, notably clinical trials, but not even just clinical trials. Let's be clear, real-world evidence has certain advantages over clinical trials. For example, clinical trials can't tell you about benefits and risks in everyday medical practice, whereas obviously clinical trials are better for the primary demonstration of efficacy. In terms of the places to concentrate, we've been working throughout the life cycle of medicinal products to look at different use cases, and we've been talking to all of the different specialist committees, and we see use cases at each step, so drug development, authorization, and in the post-authorization phase. The place in disease epidemiology, in drug utilization, and safety is best established, and I don't think anybody questions that real-world evidence has a concrete proven value in those areas. Perhaps the most controversial is the primary demonstration of efficacy, so particularly for when you don't have an existing clinical trial. But even in that situation, For very rare diseases, for example, we have examples where real-world evidence has made a major contribution to the demonstration of efficacy. So we believe throughout the life cycle and in a complementary way to other methodologies and data sources. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Lots to come back to in our discussions. But Judith Fernandez, perhaps I could come to you from an HTA body's perspective. When should we use it? Where can it really make a difference?
Thank you for the invitation. I would agree with some of the regulatory perspective, because from an HTA side, I think real-world evidence is crucial and essential to assess a highly innovative product. HTS, for example, can request additional real-world evidence since at least 1996. So you see, it's not a new concept for us. But what I think we are still observing a shift in terms of using this data, because traditionally we focus the assessment on post-launch evidence generation, and we see now more and more frequently the need to use real-world evidence at an earlier stage of the product. So I really think, and I would agree with the regulatory perspective on that, I think it is useful at all stages of the product life cycle. I think during research and development plan, it is absolutely crucial to anticipate the need for real-world evidence to address this question into joint scientific consultation, for example. I think also for highly innovative products, when the medical need is so important that it is acceptable to have an accelerated development plan, real-world evidence can be considered for external comparison, for example, to submit an HTA dossier, and this is really crucial for innovative products. We support this kind of evidence generation. I think also we see now more and more evidence generation in early access or compassionate program, and I think it's becoming more and more frequent with the COVID-19 pandemic. In France, we have an early access program that started this year, and HTS now is directly involved and authorized early access for highly innovative projects. And this program mandates real-world evidence generation, data collection during the entire early access program. So we can now have like real-world data for the first HTA assessment, which is definitely something new. So again, I would agree with the preliminary interaction saying that it's useful at all stages of the product life cycle.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that point about early stage also, we had a lot of talk in our previous sessions about early dialogue on how to use it, what evidence is needed, what are the right questions to be answered, issues we've come back to time and time again. Let's get a patient perspective and industry perspective, and then I'd like to come to the Commission, because Flora, I'd like you to be able to hear from all the different angles before you respond. But Jan LeCam, from a patient perspective, where do you see this mattering? And I was very struck in the first session when Karen was asking, she said, we need to collect the outcomes that matter to patients, but she also asked, are we putting too much burden on patients in all of this? Are we expecting too much from them? So where do you see it being useful, where not, and the role of patients within this?
Thank you first for the invitation to present the patient view along with Erwin Navarrete today. I'm not sure we're putting too much burden, at least I don't hear that in the network of patients. So at least in the area of rare diseases, I don't hear any patient advocate or family who came to us and say, oh, that's a too high burden. So for now, it seems that we still have a long way to go before we really say that. What I hear more is that could we have a better system in place to collect data all along the product life cycle and maltreatment? And it's not only for the assessment of HTA and payers' decisions, but also to improve the medical practice on this product, because when we address mostly the question of uncertainties in the context of assessment for HTA on the value and for the payers negotiation and type of agreement on payment or reimbursement, but the the first issue for the patients is, should I take that treatment? Should my child take that treatment? What are the level of uncertainties? And what's the pathway to reduce these uncertainties? And this is where we have really real ethical issues when we see that even looking at the standard treatment of enzyme replacement therapies, for instance, that you still have sometimes questions about what's the right moment to start and what's the right dose according to my weight, according to my age, according to other combination therapies. And it's really not ethical that 10 years later you still don't have answer to this question, simply because all the requests have been research question in national context, with a data collection in national context, with diverging questions, no aggregation. So you just still are in the fog on how to make the optimal use. So everything that has been said before is really music to our ears, because everything that would go in the direction of having a common identification of the questions and a consensus and the methodology on how to collect the data through the standards, with standards and common guidelines, all of everything that was said earlier, we fully agree to that. The important question for us also will be to be proportionate, and I think that was mentioned today, that what is important is the meaningful questions, and only the meaningful, useful questions, useful for the assessment, useful for the payers, useful for medical practice, and not to try to capture everything. So being proportionate is also important. But I will be more systematic than that. What I said before, it was said that, okay, somehow by default, only in exceptional cases, yes, probably in terms of medicines in general, but when it comes to rare diseases, and particularly the rarest, we're probably much more in a systematic real-world evidence collection.
Thank you very much indeed. And of course, that point you make about it's got to be the right questions. They've got to be meaningful. They've got to be useful. But we did hear that is a process that needs to be gone through to find consensus. It's not always easy to identify right questions, or the same right questions for different member states and so on. But you made also an important point about medical professionals and using this for medical decision making as well. Alexander, bring us an industry perspective, not just where we can and should use it, but also perhaps where not, do you think? And then I'll come to Flora.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about a very important topic, real-world evidence. Actually, and we've heard this from the EMA perspective, real-world evidence has been first used in regulatory procedures. I think it's almost more than 10 years ago that we initiated post-authorization and post-authorization efficacy studies, safety and efficacy studies. So it's really, and this is what I would like to start with from the industry perspective, it's really very important and a very positive development that we're taking this data into consideration also for reimbursement for HTA processes. And let me also say that it's really important that payers and HTAs are really opening up to take that data into consideration, because the other alternative in some cases might have been to say, no, we're not going to reimburse for this product. And I think over the last 10 years, there has been a trend that in certain areas, and especially in rare diseases, payers and also HTA institutions have understood that some of those diseases are not that well known. So the data which can be presented at time of launch is not that advanced as you see it in other indications such as diabetes and certain types of cancer. And I think that's a very positive development. So when we're talking about real-world evidence, I think that for me is a starting point. It's a positive thing to be taken into consideration. And we as industry are grateful that this is an option to be used also in reimbursement processes. Now, you mentioned where can it be used? It can be used to close some data gaps when there are data gaps at the time of launch. But I think one thing is very important, and here as well we can learn from the regulatory level where we have used post-launch evidence generation a bit longer. I think there needs to be a clear and good methodology, first of all. So it shouldn't be something like, okay, a registry is everything which I define as industry a registry. There need to be some questions identified, which will then be answered by some data to be generated by physicians, which is then put in the hands of the industry or transferred to the decision maker. And the decision maker, is the HTA or the payer in that case. So I think that's really very positive. I would like to bring in some elements. When from the industry perspective, we are faced with very different ideas about registries, and we are faced with a situation where we have one regulatory registry, where we have 10 other registries from France, Italy, Spain, some regions in Spain. I think my point here is really we have to be realistic what we can put to the table, and I think we really have to align. It's really important that that the regulatory level speaks to HTAs, not just when it comes to the clinical assessment.
I want to come back on this. Hang on, Alexander. Hold your horses. I want to come back on what those barriers are, and that's one of the key issues that needs to be addressed in a moment. But Flora, just to complete the picture, at this moment, as we consider what might be included within an action plan, an evidence generation action plan, and where we would go from here. First of all, in terms of, would you agree with what you've heard about its role, both where it can make the biggest difference and where there are limitations? How do you see it?
Yeah, no, thank you, Jackie. Thank you for the question. And again, thank you for inviting me to this panel. Well, indeed, the advantage of being the last that you can, especially with such a distinguished panel, you can only agree with what was said before. I think everything was said, and indeed, just to confirm also from our perspective, I mean, real-world data are a major asset, and throughout the life cycle, of course, depends on products. And as Jan said, for rare products, for instance, for rare orphan drugs, they are particularly relevant in terms of throughout the life cycle, but for all innovative technologies, definitely. The importance also to underline that they should not be seen as a replacement of the clinical trials. Obviously, that's ça va sans dire when they say that. There was recently, last week, just an extended pharmaceutical committee meeting where the regulators, so the national authorities for medicine, HTA bodies, some payer organizations were invited to discuss, among others, also this element. And this was another point clearly made. It's an asset, it's something we should rely on and have a better instrument, but definitely not to somehow replace what is the golden standard for the first assessment specifically, but and the evaluation. But one point I want to say here, and maybe I'm being, we need to be a bit patient, but I think we do have now an instrument. We will have soon an instrument that could help to address many of the points and the calls and the desire that have been pointed now and in the previous session as well. Because through my favorite subject, the regulation on health technology assessment, which will finally see the light in the end in few days, I should say, we actually would have an additional framework where we could facilitate this cooperation, which was also highlighted from several panelists as important between regulators and HTA bodies throughout the life cycle, at an early phase, at the assessment phase, at the post-launch. And I think that instrument would, in our expectation at least, really help to have a right evidence of generation, having the right question to be asked and the right data to be collected and generated at the time of the early dialogue, but also throughout the process. In the regulation, there are provisions for update, where you have a joint clinical assessment. You can establish provision which type of data you need to collect later on. And I think, it's an important instrument which will provide that framework, that consistency, and which also address what Jan was saying in terms of the patient involvement, and actually what Casey was saying at the beginning, the patient involvement, to make sure that you ask the right question, you collect the right data, because the regulation also foresee the systematic involvement of patient expert in both in product-specific assessment, early dialogue, and joint clinical assessment. So I don't want to say, that we have the solution. Well, I like to think that we have the solution. It will take some time still to get the solution up and running, but I think we have all the instrument, commitment, and interest from all parties, because here it's something that is shared and has to be built by everybody.
So thank you, Flora. I wanted to ask people about what the key enablers are to move forward. Flora, they're pointing to the HTA regulation, this framework for cooperation she sees as a real enabler to make progress on this. I'm wondering if you share that or what other ingredients you think we need to really make progress on this issue now. Let me come back. Alexander, you were talking about some of the barriers earlier, but in terms of enablers, do you think this regulation can help? What do you think the keys are to really driving this process forward now?
I mean, thanks. I think indeed, I mean, definitely the EU HTA is an enabler in that respect. There's no doubt about it, even though it's not really foreseen in a way, if I understand correctly, and Flora knows much better than me, but it's not really foreseen that we have to use it in a way. But it is an enabler in that sense that if we're doing at the time of launch or a couple of months before that, a joint clinical assessment, I think it is only natural that we would also think, do we have some data gaps which we might want to close later on? Where are those data gaps? Let's define them and let's ask specific questions, leftover questions, you can name them, and that these questions have to be answered. It's much better than having a negative assessment, a negative verdict about an individual product to say, no, it's not worth to be spending money on. It's much better to allow for more time. And in that respect, having one clinical assessment is a very good starting point for having those discussions. And I think a missing ingredient, and this can only be done at the individual case of the individual product, we need to have a clear question and a robust methodology. So it shouldn't be something like a fishing expedition where the industry is just putting at the table, I have some data here, please take a look at it. No, we need to define certain questions, and I think these questions should be answered in a given time frame. And this is what we are seeing more and more. We see that, for example, in Germany, there is an instrument initiated at the GBA level. I'd like to add one point very quickly, that to generate this data is not always easy, especially if you have, as I said before, 10 different registry requests. So we need to have clear questions, good methodology, but we also need to bear in mind that we cannot set up these registries from one week to the other. It's not easy to bring all the physicians in, to bring all the hospitals in. It takes a while in order to generate this robust data, but it's a very positive trend. And I think the EU HTA is a very good starting point.
Thank you. Peter Arnold, if I could ask you, and just linking to this question about the HTA regulation and the role it could play, it tends to focus this regulation much more on the pre-launch clinical assessment. But we've heard a lot of discussion today about post-launch assessment, evidence generation, and so on, in cases where that is needed. Do you think the HTA provides a platform to address that as well, the regulation, or do we need to look at that in a different way?
So I'm going to be really naughty and answer your previous question first. There's some very seasoned policy makers and policy followers on this panel. And you asked the question, what are the secret ingredients? Well, they're not, actually secret wasn't your word. The ingredients for doing something new, for delivering transformation, is money, political support, and sometimes legislation. I think political support is absolutely there. The digital and data strategies from the Commission, lots of strategies at national level supporting healthcare data. Law is either there or coming. I think of anticipated legal proposals on the European health data space, pharma strategy, which may well cover real-world data, real-world evidence, and of course the HTA legislation. And then money, what I would say is there's lots of money, lots and lots of money being spent by different stakeholders, both at European and national level on real-world evidence. What I would say is we need to spend smartly, and we need to think about sustainable spending, because there's been a huge number of projects, but the problem about project funding is it comes to an end and doesn't always have a legacy. And that's one of the reasons that in the European regulatory circles, where we're trying to set up Darwin EU, this distributed network, which in the long term will be funded by EMA fees. And we're looking forward to a change in the EMA fee regulation to fund that in perpetuity forever, so that it's a resource that goes on forever. If you
and the role of real world evidence in terms of that spending smartly, spending sustainably, how do we use it in the most effective way to support that?
So my point, well, okay, a few other secret ingredients, and they're things you've heard before, Vicky. Multi-stakeholder is good. Let's leverage the best that each stakeholder group can bring. Let's look at sustainable funding models for enabling the use of real-world data. Let's put it like that. So I mentioned one example that we're very close to, which is Darwin EU, but there will be others that are complementary. And then we need to break it down into data access, study methods, and evidentiary value. There is more work to be done on the place of particular study types in different use cases. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jan McCann, let me come to you in terms of the key enablers to make this happen, to realize this potential, but also the key barriers. What for you are the most difficult things that are missing? What's the gap that we're trying to fill here?
Let me maybe answer more on the enabler, which is the way to overcome the gap.
Yep.
If I'm here, as you can see by the logo at the European Parliament, it's because tonight we have a session specifically on rare disease in the plenary of European Parliament for an hour with 15 MEPs, precisely to do what Peter was mentioning, to have this political support in order to promote a European action plan on rare disease, which is the call today by the members of European Parliament, to have that, in order to have the right policies, the right legislations, the right actions, and the right money in place to make it happen. And part of this comprehensive plan is to create an ecosystem which will be conducive of certain innovation, like the one we're discussing today, real-world evidence. And I'd like to take you to one specific area where today we have major barriers and what we're proposing in order to overcome them to enable. The barrier is to gene and cell therapies for very rare diseases. For the moment, we are a failure in Europe. That's what is happening. You have a gene therapy called Stremviles for Adaskid, for the babies with severe immunodeficiency. And 10 years later, more than 10 years later after marketing authorization, they still don't have access to this treatment easily across Europe. Babies are dying, babies are not diagnosed, babies take 6 to 9 months to get to one center in Europe, which is Milano. So, and I could take other examples like that. So we want to address that because Europe is a disaster. Recently, Bluebird left. There might be a mixed reason, but one of the reasons have been the diverging decisions across Europe between Germany and France and Italy and Spain. And they say, okay, too complex, we're losing too much time, the investors are not happy, I want to save my seat as CEO and president, I leave Europe and I focus on US. And that's gonna happen more and more. So what we're saying is that this is going nowhere if we stay with our current approach. All these diseases, all the rare, and particularly the rarest diseases, when there is a gene and cell therapy, there will always be a high level of uncertainties. It's inevitable because there is a limited set of publications, limited knowledge on the rare disease itself. So the only way to reduce these uncertainties is to collect data at the European level. So the reason to collaborate at European level is certainly to negotiate prices and to speak volume even on these small populations and to use the bargaining power. But the primary reason is not this one. The primary reason is, in fact, to generate evidence together. And that's the real-world evidence approach, which can be used all along the life cycle and even before as a complement to clinical trials at the EMA or at the HTA Common Clinical Assessment. But here, it's to generate the evidence post-marketing. Okay. And last thing, Jackie, is that we're also calling for an EU fund. An EU fund, so the money has importance, an EU fund to fund this collection of evidence post-marketing. Why that? Not to save the money from the investors and industry to do that, but as an incentive for member states to come and provide access to the patients. Because the other reason, the other barrier to collect data is that the patient don't have the treatment, so you cannot collect the data. So you need to have the proper access. For most of these diseases,
okay, yeah, I'm gonna have to stop you there. Yeah, lots to discuss, lots of points that you're raising. Judith, let me come to you in terms of those key barriers. What are the problems we're really trying to tackle with an evidence generation action plan, and what you see as the key enablers to overcome them?
I believe that we are facing, and that's a reality, we are facing a lot of technical issues. We observe that at the national level, so obviously it will be even further reinforced at the European level. We have issues in terms of interoperability, in terms of data linkage between databases, and of course we need to address this kind of issue, because this is one of the main solutions to avoid duplication of data collection. And I think duplication of the data collection at the European level is really one of the major limits to the quality of the evidence. But this is the kind of issue that we need to address. I'm sure that the Darwin initiative will at least partially address some of this issue, and I know that in several countries there are initiatives to try to solve these issues. And I think one of the other and the final barrier is that from an HTA perspective, sometimes it takes too long to obtain data, and that's why I was referring to the need of anticipating the world evidence generation plan, because from an HTA perspective, it is not acceptable to wait 10 years to obtain data to address uncertainties. Innovation is time dependent. What is innovative today might not be considered isn't innovative tomorrow. So we really need to work on how to obtain data more quickly and more frequently to really monitor projects in clinical practice.
Yeah, that speed and agility is of the essence. Flora, for you, the key barriers that we need to address through an action plan, whatever form it may take, what do you think what's lacking, what's most lacking, and what do you see as the enablers to help overcome that?
It's complicated.
Big question, I know.
Big question. No, but I mean, I think as Peter also said earlier, I mean, some of the key enabler is indeed money and political willingness. And I think we are, and actually, I mean, I think the technical element can always be addressed in the sense of, to creating a database. I mean, even though that's very complex and we have quite some example of database at European level that is very difficult it's another challenge, let's say, to address. But I think we have all the ingredients to actually be successful, hopefully, because as was said earlier, the political willingness is there. Indeed, the pharma strategy has this focus not only on the bringing together the different stakeholders and the different phase of the patient access, route of a product, which is the key, especially for the life cycle. But it also because has the possibility to, we also have this interaction between regulators and HTA bodies and possibly payers. We also have the European health data space, indeed, that is trying to look at it from a more technical perspective on, how you can really create this bigger sharing of data. And Darwin is a key jewel, I would say, that we should rely on in the shorter term, and hopefully can help to develop this and to implement what the action plan for the real world data activity. So in my view, I like always to see the glass half full, and I think we have a lot of ingredient today that can bring us in the next few years to get there. It is a slow process because we are many, because we are not very at the same level of development in a different country, but that's why an important EU coordination in this area is essential for many reasons. And again, the agency is doing a great job in trying to, in putting this Darwin process and connecting with the different stakeholders. And I think the Commission is equally committed to really try to bring this agenda forward. It's not only on the real world data, but it's more on the bigger issue of ensuring accessibility of innovative drugs to everybody, because that's at the end, it's one of the delivering that our commissioner will be judged on from her mission letter. And there are quite a lot of, let's say, tools that we have now at our disposal, including, as I come back always to my favorite subject, including the regulation, which indeed has a focus, as you were saying, on the early access of, early data generation, but I think also as an important strand under the voluntary cooperation of the member states, where we would really see an opportunity to have a more agile, let's say, a cooperation on collection and sharing of real world data. Obviously, the data structure is still something that we all need to work together to make this more efficient.
Thank you very much. Got a couple of questions from the audience. One relates to pre-launch assessment and one to post-launch real-world evidence. On pre-launch assessment, the joint scientific consultation is much earlier before joint clinical assessment. Will there be an opportunity for a pre-submission meeting or follow-up advice on real-world evidence after random clinical trials are close to being completed? Alexander nodding there, clearly seeing this as an important issue. A reaction, I don't know whether you can tell us in terms of how the process, whether there are changes envisaged, but your reaction to that comment question.
Yeah, to that question, I mean, it's a very important question. I mean, when it comes to a registry, I would want to have the opportunity to talk to the regulators, but also to talk to the HTA institutions to get an understanding about where I should be heading. What data should I collect? It's what I was referring to before. I need to know what is the methodology and what are the questions which I need to answer. Otherwise, it's a bit difficult for me to generate this data. So it would be very helpful to have a pre-submission meeting if there's a registry request. It's possible, for example, in Germany, in my understanding, that you could come up and talk to GBA, for example. I mean, this is where we have registries now, and have a pre-submission meeting for the registry only. I'm not sure it will be possible in the EU HTA. I think Flora is much a better place to answer that question. I understand that slots are a bit limited, and that's a big discussion for the HTA itself. But it would be useful, just in terms of what we said before. We need to know what question needs to be answered, and we need to be clear in the methodology. So it will be useful, definitely.
Thank you very much. Peter, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think Alexander's response was through the lens of HTA. I just wanted to give it through the lens of the regulator. The word pre-submission meeting was raised, door wide open from regulators, I would say. But please, companies developing products, flag what the questions are in advance so that we can have the relevant experts at the table. We don't want to disappoint you. And then in terms of a more formal approach, scientific advice is open, door wide open. And if you want to facilitate discussion between regulators and HTA, we will invite the HTA bodies to that scientific advice meeting. So yeah, green light, door open.
Thank you very much. Flora, did you want to react to that as well?
Yeah, no, just to comment that indeed, I mean, we are just developing now all the procedure, and we will develop we start now developing all the process and procedure for all the steps of the different, the joint scientific consultation, joint clinical assessment. So obviously, we will look at what happens at national level. We look at the EMA process and procedure. So the pre-submission meeting is definitely something that can be considered, and I cannot commit, but it's definitely something that, if it's proven useful, will probably be reflected also on the HTA steps. And again, on this joint, I want to underline again, the regulation, but already now there are this parallel scientific advice between HTAs and the agency. We have done it for years under EUNETA. We are continuing to do it for the next year, and we are with the agency working very closely together to make sure that we continue this very efficient and useful exercise of having scientific advice for HTA and regulators as much as possible in parallel or together.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's take our question from Marie-Laurence Lambert from INAMI. Sorry, Judith, did you want to come in on that point?
Maybe just to add something, I think I absolutely agree with the previous talk, but just from an HTA perspective, we don't like to oppose and separate discussion. We don't like to have an early consultation on only randomized clinical trial, and once it is finished, to start thinking about what is the HTA bodies need, and should we now start the discussion on real-world evidence generation plan. we would like to see that in terms of a global plan. So that's why we always insist on having this discussion before the start of the pivotal trial and the start of randomized clinical trial. I think this is highly important.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me just come to, as I say, this question from Marie-Laurence Lambert at Dynami on post-launch real-world evidence. She says, what role do you see for existing administrative data as one possible source of post-launch real-world evidence? For instance, claims are collected routinely by National Health Insurance in Belgium. Despite their limitations, they can provide some information on real-life use of new drugs, patient profile, sequences of treatment, compliance, outcomes such as hospitalization, death. Does any country have experience in integrating such data in HTA? Can anyone help us with that? Perhaps Judith, back to you. Is it something you're doing?
Yes, definitely. In France, we have a national medical administrative databases that is based on any product, technology, or intervention reimbursed by the national solidarity. So it's basically an exhaustive database and really useful for real-world studies. Of course, it has many limitations. I will not address that right now. We have experience in terms of using this data for HTA. First of all, we have, as HAS, direct access and permanent access to the databases. So we don't have to request an access or an extraction of the data. We have a direct access. And we have accessed previously studies based on this databases, studies that were conducted by pharma company. I think it's particularly appropriate for studies when the outcomes can be measured through hospitalization, for example, in cardiovascular disease, things like that. We have an excellent example on oral anticoagulants, for example, that were assessed. And the data were taken into account by HAS to review and change the place into the treatment pathway of this drug. So we do have a lot of experience in using this data, but not on data based on other countries.
Thank you very much indeed. Anybody else wanted to come in on that point? Okay, I want to really focus now on what these building blocks might look like. Where do we go from here? I'm very struck earlier that we heard from Flemming Sonne. He said, we are collaborating, talking about this Nordic collaboration, saying, but there are things that we just can't do. They have to be done at the EU level. We need them, he said. And I just wanted to ask each of you, as we look at priorities for action, what would you identify as key next steps? Where do we go from here? And then linked to that, if you had to identify one key building block for an evidence generation action plan, one thing you want to see in it above all else. So there's a slightly different question. One is, what's the big priority for you? The one thing we need to do. The other is really where you think we need to go in immediate terms. I mean, we heard Karen talk about earlier on some of the things that need to be addressed, some of the things that we're going to need to do. She was talking about demonstration projects to consider how real world evidence can be used better. What for each of you is the key next step and the key ingredient that any action plan should contain? You have a couple of minutes each. Let me start with Jan. Let's get a patient perspective first. So the most important building block, Jan, and where we go from here.
So there were two questions. Your big vision here of what should be done. In our perspective, real world evidence is part of a favorable systemic environment for data collection, which are of quality, and on time to be used. And then the vision is within the European health data space, connected to the European Funds Network, and we also say connected to the clinical research network. So basically to have a systematic collection of data on patients to identify where they are, with which phenotype, genotype, diseases, etc., for the purpose of starting natural history studies validating endpoints, developing registries, and being attractive for clinical trials and any other type of therapy development. And the real-world evidence is placed here because for all the treatments that we have to, except few of them, but all the treatments approved by the EMA for rare disease today are delivered within the hospital environment. And today, or in few weeks, we'll have about 2,000 healthcare providers within the 24 European Foods network. So this is where it takes place. So already it is a way to simplify the question, right? You're not talking about the overall healthcare system, at least for rare disease. You're talking about 2,000 centers, 24 European Foods network. Now, let me take you to a more specific answer, which is your second question. What concretely do tomorrow? And I go back to what I said before, the very rare diseases for the gene and cell therapies. Because here, when we come to interoperability, standards, etc., it's a much simpler question. Because for most of these treatments, the treatment is going to be delivered in 1 center, in 5 centers, maybe in 20 centers. You see what I mean? And it all goes back at the end to a contract between the company, which signs with the hospital, to have the right environment, the right methodology, and the data collection. So if we want to coordinate and to be operational with real-world evidence, we can be operational 1 year from now with that on advanced therapies and very rare diseases.
Thank you very much indeed, Jan. Alexander.
Yeah, for me, the building block, and it has been mentioned, is really a multi-stakeholder. It's really important that we are asking meaningful questions in this registry, and who can be asked to identify those questions? It's patients, it's regulators, it's HTAs. We need to get everybody around the table, including industry. It's also important that industry is asked, at what point in time can you generate this data? Is it possible? Is it feasible to meet these requests which we're posing on you? So it's really important that we have a multi-stakeholder approach. And we mentioned before that we have some ingredients existing, and there's a lot of alignment about real-world evidence here. So I really think that with real-world evidence for decisions, but also with Darwin, I mean, major steps forwards can be made. And that gets me to the direction of travel. And the direction of travel for me is very much and very clearly European in this respect. It would be a bit unfortunate if we would have one clinical assessment in the HTA, but a complete patchwork among regulators and different HTAs and payers across Europe when it comes to post-launch evidence generation. So we need to align, we need to get around the table. So it's about multi-stakeholder and really, ideally, to use the next 2 years, even though we know the pharmaceutical strategy is not there, we haven't seen proposals, but why don't we start, continue the discussion to talk about methodology, what are the right questions to be asked, to seek alignment among member states, to bring them in, to bring national HTAs and national payers in. We need their perspective, because at the end of the day, I wanted to mention to what Judith said before, I totally agree that 10 years would be way too long in terms of time, but not everything is possible to do in 1 year. So
absolutely
examples, and I think for that reason, we need to have everyone on the table.
That's why I was trying to identify the sort of where do we go from here, as well as the big vision, because as you say, you can't do it all at once. Judith, a thought from you, then I come to Flora and then to Peter. Judith.
Well, from a purely HTA perspective, the first building block was already set up during the joint action 3 of the UNETA, because we had one work package that was dedicated to post-launch evidence generation. So we already initiated this strong collaboration around real-world evidence. This is something we would like to continue, and I'm sure we will continue having this discussion with the HTA regulation, because it will come naturally, I think. Something we would like to add, of course, this discussion with HTA body should involve other stakeholders, and it was already addressed. Of course, HTA bodies need to engage more actively with regulators, and I think also more importantly with patient communities. I think HTS is really in favor of including POMs and patient perspective into real-world evidence generation plan. We think that at the end, we need to narrow down the number of outcomes. The only question that matters in post-launch is, are the patients satisfied, and are the patients feeling well with this treatment? So we really highlighted the need of collecting prompts in real-world evidence in our new guidance, in the HAS guidance that was released this year. But this is something we would like to continue, a discussion that we would like to continue at the European level.
Thank you very much. Flora.
Well, I think in terms of big priority, everything was done. But for me, it's also really this life cycle approach to the technology that has to be implemented. And I think, again, we have all the instrument today in place, or we are having more or less all the instrument in place, and really needs to capitalize on that. What to do next immediately? I mean, I think what was said before, I mean, first, Darwin is indeed a major tool that we could use in the specific area of real-world evidence, real-world data, and would facilitate this multi-stakeholder approach as well, as also Alexander was saying, which is also something we are engaging very closely in the developing of in the implementation of the HTA regulation, which will require a lot of methodological work to be going and ongoing. In many areas, including how you make sure that you ask the right question and you involve the patient at the right time and throughout the process. And that's, something we are supporting through this tender that we have funding on EUNETA 21, which is really giving us a first technical input on the development of methodology to develop the guidance document that will be needed. So I make a call as well to engage with the EUNETA tender with us, because of course we are there to facilitate and to start facilitating the coordination group of HTA bodies to develop this methodology. So indeed, multi-stakeholder approach and structured cooperation. And then we have the agency, and I leave the floor to Peter, that will probably give us the money as well and the tools to do that.
Peter, a final word from you.
Look, we've got the ingredients. Let's just do it, Jackie. Our vision as regulators is that by 2025, we will have enabled the use and established the value of real-world evidence across the different use cases and the life cycle. Just in 2022, we will deliver version 1 of Darwin. We will deliver a data quality framework for medicines regulation. We will deliver a metadata framework and catalogue for real-world data, and we will pilot and embed regulatory decision-making in our committees using real-world evidence. And of course, we will also see from the Commission the legal proposal for a European health data space, which should be transformative if successful. So let's roll up our sleeves and deliver sustainable solutions that benefit patients, and let's do this step by step in partnership with stakeholders.
Thank you. And with that call to action, which I'm sure is music to the ears of everybody listening and who's joined our discussion today, thank you, panel, very much for a great discussion. I wish we had much longer, lots of things I'd like to have come back to, but we are out of time. So thank you all very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, I mentioned at the beginning of this afternoon, we had been hoping to hear from Frans van den Broeke, the Belgian Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Social Affairs and Public Health. He had hoped to meet us. He had a meeting in the Commission. You understand, in these times of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's very difficult to juggle all the demands. Unfortunately, he was hoping to join us at the end. He isn't able to, but we are delighted to have with us Anouk Wuytens, who is a councillor for Pharmaceuticals in the cabinet of the minister, to talk to us instead. Anouk, thank you so much. Thank you for helping out with organising all of this. Thank you for trying to juggle things to get in with us. But we're really delighted to have you with us to share some of his thoughts. Anouk.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Dear organisers, dear speakers and panelists, dear attendees. So the minister is very sorry that he cannot be here today, since he was very honored of delivering a keynote speech at this event. In fact, he often repeats that he considers two principles particularly important for policy making. And these principles are scientific evidence and solidarity. And the aim of the event today nicely combines these principles. We need real-world evidence for our decisions on reimbursement, thus ultimately contributing to the financial accessibility of medicines in a spirit of solidarity. Indeed, the basic objectives of drug policy are accessibility, availability, and affordability. These form a trinity within the frame of solidarity, as it were. These elements are connected and must be the subject of a global approach and strategy. The European Pharmaceutical Strategy sets out a number of beacons in this regard, and the increasingly expensive therapies are a particular point of attention and give rise to particular concern, testing the limits of solidarity we can sustain. The emerging directive on HTA is crucial in this regard. The conclusions of the Council of Ministers of Health of last June should also be taken into account. COVID crisis has taught us important lessons. The need to be well prepared and to anticipate where possible, the need to develop strong partnerships, and finally also the need to use solidarity, not only as a principle, but made visible and tangible in concrete terms. In all these endeavors, evidence is crucial to make informed decisions. Here, the digital revolution offers enormous opportunities for healthcare. Healthcare has a goldmine of data. However, its exploitation takes effort and requires new investments. Digitization is an important element in this context. It presents important possibilities to further simplify national procedures administratively and at the same time to create added value through the collection and analysis of data. In Belgium, for example, we have made electronic prescription and electronic authorization applications for reimbursement mandatory. This has led to an almost automatic reimbursement of medicines within a priority reimbursement in 55% of cases. This is already an important step in terms of financial accessibility. But in addition, these electronic applications are an important source for the collection of health data. And ultimately, we would like to develop this further into a registration and evaluation system that enables the generation of real-world data on a national scale. Life science industries and others are strongly asking for health data to support research and development. That is, to use real-world data to collect real-world evidence about the clinical effect of drugs or medical devices in clinical practice in complement of robust clinical trials. With the establishment of the Belgian Health Data Authority, which will integrate into the concept of the European Health Data Space, we are taking an important step in this direction. This authority will ensure that all conditions are met to make data available for all aspects of health and healthcare, such as population management, R&D, policy information, financing of healthcare, etc. To this end, our federal administrations involved are already in advanced consultation. Furthermore, this consultation will be expanded to other stakeholders, such as the EMA, the federated entities, the healthcare providers and healthcare institutions, the industry, Europe, and last but not least, the citizens themselves. There is no doubt that there is work to be done. Do we know sufficiently what data is available, where it is located, or whether it is sufficient quality and is swiftly available, and how that data can be shared in a secure and private respective way? In fact, it seems obvious that we need to invest more and more in providing incentives for the sharing of qualitative data. Furthermore, interoperability of systems, knowledge of the data, harmonization of processes and standards, good data governance are essential elements to achieve this. It is really important that all this is done with the consent of the citizen. The citizen has every right to know which data will be used, that this will be done in a secure manner and with full respect for the privacy, who will use the data and for which purpose. Building trust with citizens and ensuring transparency are essential to make this initiative a success. While powerful data collection and evidence generation is absolutely essential, it's not enough. Data also needs to be analyzed. and used to broaden the evidence base in order to gain insights into the value of medicinal products in the clinical setting in the real world. In this regard, the current tools do not meet the needs. Challenges still remain in terms of data available versus data needed, delay in the availability of data, questions of cooperation of clinicians and patients, questions of trust. For a number of challenges, an international approach at European level can offer a perspective, and I hope today's conference helped to bring the discussion forward. In fact, today's conference zooms in on the problems of real-world data and real-world evidence on the basis of an initiative that the National Institute for Sickness and Disability Insurance from Belgium, the RWE4Decisions, launched about 5 years ago. It brought and brings together different parties to not only reflect on the different aspects, but above all, to learn together on the basis of a practical approach and case studies. The initiative grew from the observation that the evidence base on which payers should rely with regard to reimbursement of medicines is sometimes suboptimal, especially for medicines for which virtually no valid comparators are available. We believe that this initiative has already delivered important results and launched good debates, such as today, in an international and multi-stakeholder setting. It allows to collect the information asymmetry, the information asymmetry. And in addition, the project also shows that a better interaction between regulators on European level and payers on national level must be achieved, so that payers' questions are also sufficiently addressed in an efficient and an evidence generation plan. Finally, it's clear that information and evaluation of medicines is a continuous process. Ideally, it should be possible to come to an evidence generation plan that provides transparent data that responds to the needs of both the regulator's needs regarding safety and efficacy, as well as the payer's needs regarding clinical and cost effectiveness. The elements discussed at today's conference are not just technical in nature. Essentially, it's a political debate about correct allocation of scarce resources. It's also a question of ethics. For a society needs to make sure that the common resources invested yield sufficient return. To invest resources in drugs that are insufficiently proportionate to the clinical outcomes achieved seems simply unethical. We can thus only welcome initiatives that contribute to strengthening the evidence base on which decisions are made. And we can only encourage everybody to use relevant building blocks and conclusions that emerge from this conference to further discuss them where necessary and to make them concrete in terms of policy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Anouk, for sharing those thoughts from the Minister, and please do thank him very much as well. So we heard there about underlining yet again the importance of the issue we've been discussing this afternoon, that key role that robust real-world evidence can play, complementing other sources of evidence. Minister there indicating some indications of how a real-world evidence generation action plan could help to meet those challenges, and he echoed many of the messages we've heard from a lot of our speakers this afternoon. It's now my pleasure to reflect on where we go from here, and a man who's been leading the charge on real-world evidence, if I can put it that way, Joe de Kock, former CEO of the Belgian National Institute for Health and Disability Insurance, INAMI RISIV, to give us some concluding reflections on the way forward. Joe, you've been listening intently to the debate all afternoon. Your thoughts?
Thanks a lot. First of all, thanks to all the speakers, the panelists, also the moderator for their great job and their great insights in this issue of real-world evidence in order to get better decisions. And as the Minister has remembered, the creation of this initiative was based on the need of preparedness and to increase also awareness amongst different stakeholders with regards of the collection and the use of real-world data when assessing the value of treatments for patients and healthcare system. It is a payer-led initiative, and it is based, as Karen Facey stressed, on a learning by doing approach, but also with the aim to increase mutual understanding. And we know, of course, as was said in this conference, it is one part of a more bigger picture, of a big picture, but nevertheless an important one. We have heard about the main outcomes of the project and of the workshops, which were clearly explained by Dr. Karen Facey. And out of the other panels, I have distillated a number of ideas and conclusions. I think the first thing is the place of real-world evidence. The first thing I heard is, of course, real-world evidence is not a panacea. It's not a standalone issue, but nevertheless, real-world evidence as a concrete and clear place within, and could be, if appropriately used, be a vital part of an integrated evidence generation plan for highly innovative technologies for which there are huge uncertainties. That's the place. It's something which is not a one-shot, it's not a one-off, on-off issue, but it's an ongoing and structural need for iterative dialogues among different stakeholders, along the whole life cycle of a product. And I think these interactions are needed to identify specific gaps and uncertainties with regard to access, availability, and affordability of these highly innovative technologies that could potentially be resolved by using real-world evidence as complementary information. Thirdly, I think this integrated evidence generation plans, which are at stake of this conference this afternoon, should address, and it was clearly mentioned by most of the panelists, should address the needs of regulators, HTA, and payers. I come back that, of course, more stakeholders are involved, but the needs are expressed by regulator, HTA, and payers. I come back on the patients, of course, also. And what I heard is that there is a need to move from a fragmented recommendation and fragmented projects to comprehensive guidance to improve the standards, the methodologies, and the credibilities of real-world data studies. One of the instruments in which real-world evidence is used, or could be used for payers, is the outcome-based managed entry agreements. And Karen expressed a little bit and commented the recommendations which came out of these different workshops. I can add to that, of course, to support this outcome-based managed entry agreements, it is needed to have this real-world generation plan, but it should be not too sophisticated. It should be proportionated, it should be agile, and it should be doable for the different stakeholders. And it should, of course, take account also of the post-marketing data requirements, as was stressed by some of the panelists. And of course, this requires investments, not investments in personnel only, in data analysis only, but also in data infrastructures and an alignment all over Europe of approaches across borders. And we heard about Darwin, which is a magnificent tool, a giant tool, which is very promising. Also, the health technology assessment regulation, which was announced and will be finalized end of this year, as Flora Giorgio mentioned. I think it's a great result also. And of course, don't not forget the endeavors inside the European health data space, which has also a crucial role in this regard. Collaboration, it was one of the words which came out of the Claude wording. Collaboration between all stakeholders, not only HTAs, payers and regulators, but of course industry, patients, clinicians, and academia should, of course, work together in order to deliver high quality, reliable clinical data that could reduce the decision relevant uncertainties identified at the point of market launch, but also at the point of pricing and reimbursement. As it is a matter of a life cycle approach, of course, this real world data can be, of course, as important in treatment optimization, but also in capturing the elements from the patients, the quality of life, the prompts. Cooperation and collaboration go hand in hand, and we have seen some key asks to the European Union to have, of course, the lead in more structuring these important issues. But what I heard also is that it's not only a question of political willingness, it's not only a question of resources and law. I would add a third thing. It is also a question of implementation on the field. And therefore, these elements prove also that there is a need to support decision makers through the sharing of practical learnings and practical learnings on the use of real-world evidence in practice. Therefore, we will continue, of course, our work collaboratively with different stakeholders, also focused on rare diseases, knowing that, of course, these European reference networks and the European reference network structures are of great importance to get access for people with rare diseases, as Jan Le Camp stressed it very well, and there more European coordination is feasible and is possible to realize at the short term, which is an important message also. And I think that all these initiatives, we will do it, of course, not alone. We are not also a standalone initiative. We want to collaborate clearly with other alternatives in order to get robust real-world evidence which can be developed and used in practice. We are preparing our plans for 2022. We are creating our steering group. You find more information about this on our website, and you will find the website of it will be published on the screen soon. But I think that are some main conclusions. The future is bright. We have to do it together. And I think we believe that there is a clear need to continuing this efforts. We are convinced that they are contributing to improve the decision-making of this truly innovative treatments. It's a common challenge. Let's use the data that matters. Let's use them correctly. Let's just do it together and interest. I thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Joe, and thank you for your passion for the cause and also your optimism, ending on such an upbeat note. We can do it, really echoing what Peter Arlett said about let's just get on with it. You have been demonstrating that in action, so thank you so much. Thank you to all our speakers this afternoon for a very rich discussion, lots of ground covered. Thank you to Real World Evidence for Decisions for hosting us this afternoon and for organising this event. And thank you to all of you for joining us, for your questions, for your comments. There will be opportunities. In a moment, you'll see a button will magically flash up on your screen, inviting you to network with some of the other participants. If you can stay and take advantage of that, that would be great. But it only remains for me to wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you very much and goodbye.